In the time of Herod, the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. He belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all of the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was startled, and he was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit before he is even born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people who are prepared for the Lord." When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. Let's pray. God, as we explore this virtue of joy, I pray that you would help us unpack this in our lives, because sometimes it doesn't always come naturally. Blankets get piled on top of our lives, and we seem to find our way struggling for that breath, that fresh breath, that new breath of what it means to have you in our lives. I would humbly ask, God, that your word would be spoken through mine into our everyday lives. Amen. An author named William Boggs once wrote this: "How is it that a message as fresh and as invigorating as the one that the Bible gives us becomes more like taking a dose of castor oil than biting into a juicy, refreshing peach?" Great question. How is it that God's Word, the Bible, can become something that is dry, boring, old, something that we don't really relate to, when in fact it should be a bite from a refreshing peach? What William Boggs goes on to say is that the problem is we don't kind of go to the peach orchard in the garden. We hang around the edges where the trees aren't quite as tasty and nutritious. They're the trees of morality and legalism, and we emphasize those things in our Christian faith. And this is not to say that morality and legal things aren't part of who we are. I mean, there are rules God has given them. He expects us to live by them. But that's not the focus of the gospel. The focus of the gospel is a message of joy. It's a message of Christ. It's a fresh, juicy, refreshing peach. John the Baptist was sent to remind people of that, because that's the struggle that Israel was having at that time. There were these groups of leaders called Pharisees and Sadducees. They were the ones who kept the law and who talked about the law, and he made sure that the laws were being interpreted correctly. They made people eat bitter fruit that was hard, because it was all about the rules. And God says, "I'm going to send John the Baptist, and John the Baptist is going to speak about joy, and he's going to speak about who Christ is in our lives, because that's what this should be about." Our relationship with God is not a relationship of rules and legalism. It's about joy, it's refreshing, it's finding life. So John the Baptist comes in that context to point people to the center of the garden, to the peach grove, to the Word, to Jesus Christ, the one who brings joy. It would be a challenge though. For John, this was a challenge. This didn't come easy. You'd think that bringing a message of joy to everyone would be an easy task. How difficult is that? Surely everybody would be open to that message. Not the ones who keep the rules and write the books on the rules. You're going to spoil their message if you bring a message of joy. If you speak about refreshing peaches and you're trying to organize people's lives around 614 commandments and whether they obeyed them or not. It was difficult for John to bring a message of joy. That's strange. But it's the same truth and the same struggle that we find. So what we're going to do in the story is we're going to visit a little bit about John, we're going to visit a little about Elizabeth and Zechariah, and we're going to visit a little bit about ourselves and the need to bring the message of joy, and that sometimes it's hard for us to bring a message that should be so easy. Here's what John had to face in his lifetime. He would have to bring this message of joy as an itinerant preacher. In other words, he went all over the place. Didn't always have to say so in where he was going. He had to be critical of the people who wanted to focus on the trees on the outside of the garden that produced a hard... Babe, what was that big giant tree that we saw? A what? Hedge apple tree. We saw a hedge apple tree just either side of Subway while we were eating lunch one day. We saw these giant fruits on the tree, and Terry said, "What is that?" A hedge apple apparently is not very tasty. Apparently it's very hard. Okay, so when you're talking about fresh peaches and somebody's trying to write a book on hedge apple trees, it's hard. So sometimes John had to go out and speak against the Pharisees and the Sadducees who were focusing just on the rules. In fact, there were times where John had to be, so poignant that he began to irritate the rulers of the time and he lost his life because of it. He had to make himself less so that Jesus could be more. Here they're saying about John the Baptist, he's going to be this guy Elijah, who, if you read your Old Testament, was a really, really impressive human being. So here John has to pack all of this away. People are thinking, he's this guy, he's that guy. Maybe he's Jesus, maybe he's the Messiah. And John's trying to say, no, it's not me. I'm just pointing the way. I'm just pointing out that there's a different place in this garden. There's a different guy in the story. There's a different point to the story. There was the challenge of preparing the way for the Lord in the life that he lived. So, sending out joy became quite the challenge for John. But it started in a good early period of his life. In fact, it started with his mom and dad, Elizabeth and Zechariah, who knew joy, who served God out of joy, whose witness was joy. But they had it hard. It wasn't always easy for them to bring that word. As Dawn so aptly illustrated in the children's moment, there can be hopes that we have in life that either never come to fruition or may come into fruition much further in life than we had hoped. What do you do with that when that's kind of dragging around with you? When that disappointment always seems to weigh on your heart? And some of you have been through those roads of disappointment, and some of you carry them now. How do you have joy in the midst of that moment? When life's pushing down on you, when things aren't going the way that, you had hoped they would go. Or that you had hoped they would go for your children. What happens in those moments? But Zechariah and Elizabeth were aware of God's grace. If you want to know what the central flavoring is to that good, refreshing peach in that peach orchard in the middle of the garden, it's God's grace. And they were aware of it. And somehow, through all of this endurance and the hope that they had in their lives and the disappointment that they had in their lives, they clung to God's grace. God's grace. God's love shared with us even though we don't deserve it. God's mercy shared with us even though we don't deserve it. God's forgiveness shared with us even when we don't ask for it. This is the thing that they began to discover and they began to unpack. And then comes this incredible moment, a miracle, where they will have a son. A son who would point the way to Jesus Christ. So what Elizabeth and Zechariah learned throughout their lives, not just in the instance of John the Baptist being born to them, is that with God everything is possible.
It may not happen in the time that I want it to happen. It may not happen in the way that I want it to happen. But the joy is discoverable in the way that I allow God to allow it to happen. That's what grace is, or the response to grace is God giving in His own way and in His own time, and me receiving that. Zechariah and Elizabeth had to learn that sometimes in a long and patient kind of way. But they learned it. They learned it through the obstacles that they faced and the challenges that they were facing. And somehow that joy fueled them. It invigorated them. It gave them reason to speak about this Jesus Christ and this word of hope that was coming along. I know we think we know the Christmas story, but I'd encourage you, go home. Pick up the Gospel of Matthew, pick up the Gospel of Luke. You can skip through all of the genealogy stuff. But read the story. Read the story of Elizabeth and Mary. Read those stories. Be familiar with the joy that they had and some of the struggles that they had to deal with as they went through it. So, let's talk about us. John the Baptist had to preach joy and bring joy, and sometimes that was a challenge for him. Elizabeth and Zechariah had to preach joy, and sometimes that was a challenge for them in dashed hopes in their life. But what about us? We're asked to give that same message. We're asked to give the same message that Jesus Christ gives. So the question is not just, are you delivering the message? The question is, what kind of message are you delivering? What kind of message are you delivering? Because we can deliver a message of hedge apples. We can go down the list of rules and the thou shall and shalt nots in the book and emphasize that. We can do that and do it in the context of juicy, refreshing fruit. What kind of message is it that we bring? Luke 1:17. Here's part of the promise that's given with John the Baptist. And he, being John the Baptist, will go on before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children. To turn the hearts of the parents to their children. What was going on there? That out of this whole announcement, there's two groups that are picked. To turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous. The one being most righteous is Jesus Christ. Out of this whole incredible announcement, there's two groups that are lifted up. Parents and those who are disobedient. Sometimes that could be one and the same, but we're going to keep them apart for now. So parents, I want to ask you. What do you hope for your children spiritually? What do you hope for your children spiritually? What do you pray about at night for your children spiritually? There are lots of things we need to be praying for, but what are you praying for in terms of their spiritual lives? What is your hope for your children spiritually? And how are you going to get there? How are you going to get there? Obviously, this was a concern then. I think it's a concern now. You're not alone in this, but we need to know how to help you. To turn the hearts of the parents to their children. What do you pray for your children spiritually, and what's happening to allow them to experience that spiritual joy? Because sometimes trying to share that message of joy as a parent is hard. When your children are walking against you, pushing against you, know all of those little buttons. Yeah, and all you kids are going, yeah, no, we don't do that. It's hard. Like it was hard for John the Baptist in the middle of a desert, eating locusts and honey, to preach joy, because the desert is harsh. Sometimes in parenting, you're standing in the middle of that desert and it's harsh. Yet the message that you're asked to bring is that message of joy. I want to borrow a little bit from last week where we said joy isn't necessarily happy, whoopee, dancing. That's not what the joy that we're talking about here. Joy is that centeredness in knowing that God is at work in your life and the grace of God is yours. That's joy. It's the peace that comes from that. It's the strength that comes from that. That's the message that we are to proclaim. So those of you whose kids have moved out of home and grown up, those of you who don't have kids, pray for the parents as they seek to bring that message of joy to their kids' lives. Seek to bring the message of Christ, because I pray that that would be your most central prayer, that your child would know Jesus Christ. Our January sermon series is about knowing God. What does it mean to know God? How do you know God? So in that sense of the word, how do they know Jesus? Not just about Jesus. Please, I want to make those two sentences very different from each other. It's different to know about Jesus than it is to know Jesus. Very, very different. I pray that you are praying that your kids will know Jesus. And then the second word. And the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous. And the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous. I think disobedient there is being used in the broadest sense of the word. A person who doesn't really have interest in God in their lives, or whose lives are too full to even want to allow God in. Or maybe to those who make a decision to not allow God in. To me, that's the ultimate form of disobedience, is to push God away. What is the prayer there? That they would know the righteousness of Christ. That's part of that joy. I mean, being in bondage, being in prison, being entrapped, being restricted in your life, and then being set free. That's joy. That's what Jesus Christ brings to us. Is that sense of being set free. Is that sense of joy. Is that sense of knowing that God has forgiven you. And knowing that God will continue to forgive you. And knowing that your forgiving others produces joy within your own life and meaning in your own life. Because we are experiencing grace. Because we are experiencing love on a level where it's not earned. Where it's not dependent on whether or not I do or don't do. That's joy. And that's part of what is being asked that we preach in terms of the good news. Part of what we are being asked to live our lives towards. Is that our life would loudly proclaim Jesus Christ brings joy, because Jesus Christ brings freedom and liberty, especially from your own self. We are asked, just like John, that we would prepare the way for the Lord. That through our lives and through our example and through the joy that we have, hopefully, we would prepare a way for others, that they would know who Jesus is. That through our tough times, through the difficult times in our own lives, that we would learn what joy is. Through the challenges in life and the disappointments in life, that we would learn what the joy of Jesus Christ is. And that would then become a story, a witness to others. That would then become an invite to others. Because friends, if the joy of Jesus is only available in the good times, that's a sad, sad story. But the story of Jesus, as we are reminded by looking at people like John and Zechariah and Elizabeth, is that the joy of Christ is available to all at all times, even when I'm feeling miserable. The joy of Christ is there. Even when I feel like a failure, the joy of Christ is there. Even when I struggle in my own journey, the joy of Christ is there. And again, we're not talking joy here in the sense of a party favor. We're talking about joy here in the sense of God's presence. The peace that comes with that. The strength that comes with that. So let's leave with this question. Does your life say to others that God can do things through you that you never thought were possible? That God can do things through you that you never thought were possible. That's joy. Let's pray. God, what a simple and powerful message, the message of joy. Why is it then that so often it seems to get buried? And God, as we stand and sit before you now, we are all guilty of that. That somehow the circumstances of our lives and our feelings in life just push joy to the background, and we're left with these hard apples of rules and laws. God, would you help us to rediscover our first love? Would you help us rediscover the passion of a relationship with you? Would you help us discover that the meaning and purpose in life is found in you and you alone? Would you help us rediscover, God, that being entrapped by thinking that we know best has a key to liberty, and that is by allowing you to lead a life where you know best. Friends, if you've hung around the edge of that garden eating hard apples, pray this prayer after me. Pray it quietly within your hearts. God, I need joy. Thank you for bringing that gift to me. God, I've forgotten to live my life with you at the center. I open myself and I say, God, be the center of my life again. Even now as I sit here, forgive me, set me free. And in your freedom, I thank you for that sense of joy and the peace that comes with it.